Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I grew up believing there was a college fund with my name on it, and not just a vague idea, but something my parents mentioned often enough that I treated it like a certainty. They would say things like, "Don't stress about loans, we've got you covered," or "Just focus on your grades, your fund is safe." I carried that phrase, "your fund," like a promise carved in stone, and I built my entire sense of security on it, because what kind of parents talk about a college fund for years if it doesn't exist? By the time senior year rolled around, my classmates were scrambling to figure out how they were going to pay for school. Some of them were hunting scholarships, others were preparing to drown in loans, and I felt this strange mix of sympathy and relief because I thought, at least in this one area of life, I was safe. I had done everything right, kept my grades strong, avoided trouble, worked a few part-time shifts here and there to have some pocket money, and trusted my parents when they said I wouldn't need to worry. But the second I sat at the kitchen table with acceptance letters spread out and asked how the fund would be handled, I felt the ground shift. My mom gave me that tight smile she always uses when she is about to deliver news she knows will piss you off, and she said, "Well, honey, things changed. The money isn't really available right now. You'll need to take out loans like everyone else." That sentence hit me harder than any rejection letter ever could. My dad chimed in with the classic line, "It builds character to pay your own way," and I remember sitting there thinking, then why the hell did you keep telling me for years that this was taken care of? But I swallowed my frustration because I had no backup plan. I signed the loan papers, convinced myself maybe it was just bad timing, and promised myself I would deal with it later. That was the first time I understood how easy it is for people to rewrite history while you are still standing in the middle of it. College was a grind. I carried classes, jobs, and debt all at once, and yet I still sent home small bits of money whenever my mom would call and say, "The electric bill came early," or "Your brother needs new cleats." I felt like that was my duty, because I was the responsible one, the one who always came through. I never questioned that dynamic, not until years later when my brother, Evan, got into law school and suddenly the same parents who told me money isn't available turned around and told the whole family how proud they were to be funding his education. Funded fully. First year, no loans. Covered. And they said it with pride, as if it was proof of their dedication, not proof of their betrayal. When I asked my mom why it was different for him, she didn't even flinch. She said, "Law school is professional school, and it's an investment in his future. Undergraduate is just basic education." She dismissed mine as if it was nothing more than high school plus a cafeteria. I cannot describe the feeling of hearing that from your own mother. I worked for every meal ticket, begged professors for schedule flexibility, watched interest pile up on federal loans, and she had the nerve to act like it was just an elective hobby compared to her golden boy's law degree. That night I sat on my bed with my old laptop, scrolling through emails, voicemails, anything that would prove I hadn't imagined the fund. And there it was, plain as day, "Your fund is safe. You just keep doing your best." My mom's voice, cheerful, recorded on my phone back when I still believed her. I stared at that file and thought, why am I still sending them money? Why am I still paying for the family phone plan? Why am I still carrying the joint credit card she insisted on keeping open for emergencies? Every month, automatic payments bled out of my checking account into theirs, and I treated it like an unchangeable fact of life. That night, I realized I wasn't trapped. I was complicit. The next morning, I cut them off. I stopped the transfers, called the bank, and shut down the family phone plan. I closed the credit card and put fraud alerts on my account. It was the first time in my life I chose myself over their approval, and it felt both terrifying and liberating. But when I checked my credit file just to make sure nothing else was floating out there, something caught my eye. There was an inquiry linked to a home equity line of credit, opened the same year I started college. And the account nickname? It included my name. That was the moment I realized this went deeper than broken promises. Something about that loan wasn't just bad timing. My name was tied to money that I had never seen, money that vanished the exact year I was told, "The fund isn't available." And suddenly every word, every voicemail, every smile looked different in hindsight. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, It might have been financial in ways I had not even discovered yet. And that is where everything really began. When I saw my name tucked into the nickname of that home equity line that conveniently appeared the same year I was told the so-called fund was unavailable, I understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a temporary cash flow issue, but a story that had been edited to keep me compliant. So I called the only person in the family who tells the truth even when it burns, my Aunt Marlene, who answered on the second ring with that flat tone she uses when she already knows something is wrong and is deciding how many bandages to bring. And when I asked her if she had ever heard my parents talk about my college fund, she let out a sigh that sounded like years and said, "Yes, they spoke about it for ages, always promising that I was taken care of, always mentioning that it was set aside and safe." And then she added, carefully, that around the time I left for school there was talk about a bridge loan on the house because things were tight for just a little while, and later she heard that a lump sum labeled college helped with a deposit for Evan's first semester of law school because, in my mother's words, it was the most strategic use of family resources. I listened to her explain this without dramatics, and I realized that the promise of my fund had not been a slip of memory or a hopeful phrase tossed around the dinner table, but a deliberate script crafted to keep me in a role where I kept performing, kept smoothing, kept wiring money for the family phone bill and the emergency card and the sneakers for the kid who would grow up into the lawyer whose tuition, apparently, needed no loans. And in that moment the idea of confronting them in the old way, with pleading and emotion and the dance they know by heart, felt pointless. So I decided to build a clear record that could stand on its own without my voice shaking or my mother's sighs about sacrifice drowning it out. I pulled my credit reports from every bureau and froze them. I filed disputes on anything that used my name without my knowledge, and I documented the timeline with dates and exact phrases pulled from saved emails and voicemails. Then I wrote a short, calm message to the extended family that read like a memo rather than a cry for attention, where I laid out the basic sequence of events, the repeated promise of a dedicated college fund for me, the pivot to loans for my undergraduate degree, and the sudden and very public funding of my brother's law school. And I attached a transcript of my mother's sweet voicemail saying your fund is safe, because if we were going to traffic in narratives then mine needed to be precise, provable, and impossible to wave away as a daughter's bitterness. Predictably, the replies came in waves, with a couple of relatives sending careful notes about not getting involved, and one cousin asking whether I was sure I had understood correctly, and two older aunts sending me private messages saying they always wondered how the story added up since my parents are not exactly liquid. And across all of it, I felt a calm I had not felt since I first sat at that kitchen table, because for once the facts were not trapped in my head, they were out in the world, where people could make their own judgments, and whether they chose to or not was not my problem anymore. I declined the invitation to Evan's law school celebration and returned a monogrammed gift my mother had asked me to contribute to with a brief note that said, "I am not participating in a story that is not true." And while that line probably stung in the living room where appearances are oxygen, it was the first sentence I had written in years that felt like it belonged to me rather than to the version of me they had cast. That night my mother called, and before I could say much she told me I was being cruel, that I was jealous, that I was trying to ruin my brother's moment, and then, when I did not bite, she said the one thing that gave away the real leverage inside their panic, which was that I needed to stop before I made things awkward for Evan's character and fitness. And while the words might sound bland to anyone outside the process, I knew enough to hear the alarm hidden inside them, because character and fitness is the part of the bar application where messy family facts, financial honesty, and patterns of behavior can matter. And if my parents had built a story on a foundation of promises and transfers misnamed college, then they understood that the shine on his professional image could crack under the stress of simple truth. I did not threaten her, and I did not raise my voice. I only said that I would not lie for anyone and that from this point forward I would communicate in writing. Then I ended the call and sent her a follow-up email documenting what she had said and stating that I had frozen my credit, recorded the timeline, and would be requesting documentation from the bank regarding the account that bore my name inside an internal label. and in that moment, I realized how different it feels to stop trying to win an argument and start moving paper that does not need approval to matter. Over the next few days, I acted like a boring administrator of my own life, which turned out to be the most powerful posture I could take, because I was not begging for fairness, I was establishing a record, and each step, credit freeze, disputes, timelines shared with the exact relatives my mother resents being judged by, phone plan terminated, emergency card closed, shifted the weight of the story off my shoulders and onto the documents where anyone could see how the promises lined up with the money they claimed did not exist, and by the time I took a breath, I felt that click you feel when you finally stop hoping someone will do right by you and start doing right by yourself. Late the following evening, as I was finishing a draft of the letter I planned to send the bank, my phone lit up with a message from my mother that said I was going to regret making a spectacle and that I had no idea how this could affect Evan's future. And while I could have ignored it, I took a screenshot and added it to the file because I wanted a clean trail, and just as I was about to put the whole thing away for the night, a thought slid in that changed the tone of my next move entirely. Because if she was invoking character and fitness already, that meant there were things she feared might be asked that she could not spin, which begged a simple question that I realized I finally wanted answered on the record. What exactly did they label as college? And where, line by line, did it go? When I finally opened the account statements and the transaction history that had been quietly sent to me through a cousin who understood the unspoken rules of our family, I could see every single dollar that had moved from the so-called college fund into places that had nothing to do with my education, and as I scrolled through line after line of transfers, I felt a strange mixture of disbelief and clarity, because while part of me had suspected their manipulation for years, seeing it laid bare in black and white gave the story a weight and tangibility that no argument, no shouting, no confrontation at the dinner table could ever have provided, and in that instant, I understood that the real power my parents had wielded was not over money, but over narrative, over the way family loyalty had been weaponized to make me feel grateful and patient for a future that never existed. The first entry I saw was deceptively mundane, a deposit labeled college savings that, within the same week, had been siphoned to cover a luxury home renovation for my brother and a series of high-interest loans that had nothing to do with any educational need. And I noticed that each entry was carefully annotated in the family ledger with phrases that sounded almost benign, like strategic investment or long-term planning, and as I traced the trajectory of every dollar, I realized that what had been portrayed as a temporary reprieve, a minor financial shuffle to cover some unexpected expense, was actually a meticulous and ongoing diversion, orchestrated to ensure that my brother's life had a financial springboard while mine remained tethered to promises that had no real foundation, and the meticulousness of it all made my stomach twist, because the depth of calculation revealed a level of premeditation that went beyond mere favoritism and into the territory of intentional erasure of my security. I spent hours constructing a visual timeline, mapping each deposit, withdrawal, and transfer to a calendar, noting the exact dates when my mother and father had assured me that the funds were secure, and pairing them with receipts, invoices, and bank memos that showed the money had been redirected elsewhere, and as the hours passed, a sense of methodical empowerment began to replace the shock and anger I had initially felt, because every line I added to the chart was a line of truth, a piece of reality that could no longer be denied or rewritten by someone else's story, and by the time I was done, I had a document that not only recorded what had happened, but implicitly demonstrated the pattern of intentional deception and favoritism that had shaped my adult life without my consent. Once I had the full timeline, I drafted a formal inquiry to the bank, detailing each account, each transfer, and each questionable annotation, requesting official confirmation of the destination and purpose of the funds labeled under my name. And I included a cover letter that was calm, precise, and devoid of emotion, because I understood that emotion would have diluted the impact of the facts, and as I sent it, I realized that the act of asking for accountability, of requiring an institutional response, was in itself an act of reclaiming power, because for the first time, The story of my life was intersecting with official records rather than the selective memory and curated narratives of my parents. And this intersection could not be manipulated with charm or guilt or platitudes about family sacrifice. The following days were a quiet storm of reflection and observation because I watched how my parents responded to the subtle changes in family dynamics without directly confronting them, noting the tightness in my father's jaw during phone calls and the hurried, clipped tone of my mother's voice when discussing anything related to finances or Evan's tuition, and I began to see that the fear they tried to instill in me through coded warnings about reputation, character, and social expectation was not based on truth but on the fragility of the structure they had built to maintain control, and recognizing that allowed me to navigate interactions with a new sense of detachment, as though I were observing actors in a play that I had finally been allowed to script alongside. I also took care to document every interaction with the extended family, saving emails, messages, and even casual text exchanges, because while they might not intervene directly, their presence as witnesses could support the narrative I was building. And over time, I noticed a subtle shift in how certain relatives spoke to me, their questions less cautious, their tone less filtered, as if the accumulation of small facts had begun to loosen the grip of the family's usual choreography of deception, and I felt a growing confidence that the truth, once codified and recorded, could not be easily erased or ignored, and that for the first time in years, I was not only a participant in the family narrative, but its steward, holding the ledger and timeline that could not be twisted or denied, and with that realization came a quiet, resolute determination to see the process through to its conclusion, regardless of discomfort, conflict, or lingering resentment. By the time the week ended, I had a full dossier ready for submission to the bank and for safekeeping, complete with scanned statements, annotated charts, and copies of all relevant communications. And while the act of assembling the documents was laborious and sometimes emotionally draining, it was also a reclamation of agency that I had not experienced before, a sense of ownership over my own financial and personal story. And as I placed the final document in a sealed envelope, I understood that this was not revenge or punishment, but an unassailable record, a testament to the years of careful observation, diligence, and the refusal to accept a narrative imposed by those who benefited from my silence, and in that moment, I finally felt the first true measure of liberation in a life that had long been constrained by promises that were never intended to be kept. The morning I decided to confront the reality of my parents' decisions, I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of documents, spreadsheets, and screenshots that I had compiled over weeks of painstaking investigation. Each line of data tracing a path of favoritism, deception, and selective generosity that had allowed my brother's life to flourish, while mine had been quietly constrained, and as I reviewed the chronology for the 100th time, I felt a strange mixture of empowerment and exhaustion, because knowledge, while liberating, carried a weight that could not be ignored or easily set aside, and I understood that the confrontation I was preparing for would not be a momentary clash of words, but a battle over narrative, perception, and the subtle manipulation of family loyalty that had defined my life for decades. I began drafting a letter, not as an emotional outburst, but as a precise, almost forensic account of every transaction, every promise, and every deliberate omission, carefully detailing dates, amounts, and recipients. And I made certain that my tone was measured, professional, and unwavering, because I knew that the potency of my argument would reside not in anger or hurt feelings, but in the undeniable clarity of evidence. And as I typed, I could feel a sense of purpose building, a determination to reclaim the story of my own life from the web of control my parents had spun, a story in which my sacrifices, patience, and trust had been exploited for the benefit of someone else's ambition. By mid-afternoon, I had arranged the documents into a binder, annotated with notes in the margins, color-coded tabs to highlight discrepancies, and cross-references that made the diversion of funds impossible to dispute, and as I flipped through the pages, I realized that I had transformed months of frustration, quiet suspicion, and emotional turbulence into an instrument of clarity and accountability, an organized account that demanded recognition not through confrontation but through the undeniable force of recorded fact, and in that realization, I discovered a quiet thrill, because for the first time in my life, I held a tangible representation of my agency. A proof of autonomy that could not be ignored or belittled by dismissive remarks or familial charm. When I finally called my parents to arrange a meeting, I felt a tension in my chest that was both familiar and alien. Because the act of speaking to them after having prepared such meticulous evidence reversed the dynamic that had dominated our interactions for years, and as we sat in the living room, the same room where countless family celebrations had been staged to maintain appearances, I could see subtle changes in their posture, the way my father's hands rested tensely on his knees, the carefully neutral tone of my mother's voice, and I realized that they were confronting a version of me that had been absent in every previous discussion, a version equipped with facts, certainty, and the refusal to negotiate the truth. I began by walking them through the timeline, explaining each transaction, each transfer, and each diversion of funds, and as I spoke, I noticed the way their faces shifted imperceptibly, a tightening around the eyes, a hesitation in speech, as though they were grappling with a reality they had never anticipated facing, and while I kept my voice calm and my demeanor collected, I allowed my words to carry the weight of years of overlooked effort, unacknowledged diligence, and the quiet endurance of a child who had been asked to trust without question, and in that moment, I understood that the confrontation was less about seeking apology and more about establishing undeniable clarity, about asserting ownership over my story in a space where manipulation had previously been unquestioned. Hours passed as I meticulously explained the evidence, referenced invoices, and highlighted discrepancies that could not be dismissed, and while the discussion was civil in tone, the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Because each point I made chipped away at the carefully constructed narrative that had allowed my parents to dictate terms under the guise of care, and by the time the conversation ended, I had delivered not a demand but a declaration that I would no longer acquiesce to a narrative that had been written for me, that I would not allow familial obligation to obscure the truth, and that the ledger of my life, meticulously maintained and indisputably documented, was now mine to hold, interpret, and protect. As I left the room, binder in hand, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation, because while the confrontation had not rewritten the past or erased the decisions that had favored my brother, it had shifted the balance in the present, establishing a precedent of accountability and recognition, and I realized that the work of reclaiming my autonomy would continue, not through public displays of anger or resentment, but through careful vigilance, documentation, and the unwavering assertion that my story, my effort, and my life were not subordinate to the desires or narratives of others, and in that knowledge, I found a sense of quiet, profound satisfaction, a recognition that truth, once codified and presented with clarity, cannot be denied or rewritten, and that the act of claiming it is itself a form of liberation that no familial hierarchy can diminish. The evening that followed the confrontation carried a weight I had not anticipated, because while the room had been filled with words, documents, and the tangible assertion of evidence, the silence that settled afterward was far more potent, stretching across the house like a tangible presence that neither of us could ignore, and as I moved through the familiar hallways, I began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed, the faint scuff marks on the hardwood floor, the way the light from the street lamps pooled unevenly across the living room rug, and the subtle creaks in the ceiling that seemed to echo the unspoken tension lingering in every corner, creating an atmosphere where the ordinary was reframed into a backdrop for reflection, reckoning, and the faint, insistent hum of possibilities that had been dormant for far too long. I returned to my bedroom, closing the door with a deliberate calmness that contrasted with the turmoil still simmering beneath the surface, and I allowed myself a moment to consider the implications of what had transpired. Because in confronting my parents with the meticulously organized binder of evidence, I had not merely challenged their decisions or questioned their judgment, but I had asserted a sovereignty over my own narrative that could not be undermined by charm, manipulation, or familial expectation. And in that quiet, contemplative space, I felt a mixture of liberation, responsibility, and the undeniable gravity of the fact that life had shifted irrevocably in a direction I had long imagined but only now brought into motion. As I sifted through my thoughts, I recognized the duality of the situation, because while the confrontation had clarified the reality of past injustices, it also illuminated the path forward, a path that demanded both strategic patience and emotional fortitude, requiring me to navigate not only the practical implications of documented inequity, but also the complex terrain of relationships that had been carefully cultivated over decades. And as I considered each possible move, each potential interaction, and the subtle shifts in perception that could result from the information I had delivered, I felt a deep, unyielding sense of agency, a realization that the stewardship of my life and its narrative rested squarely in my own hands, and that every subsequent choice would be informed by the clarity, courage, and precision I had summoned during the confrontation. The following days were filled with subtle observations, the quiet monitoring of behavior that revealed more than any words could, because my parents, now confronted with irrefutable documentation, approached each interaction with a measured caution that spoke volumes about the impact of accountability on long-established patterns of control, and I noticed the way their decisions, once swift and self-serving, were now tempered by the awareness that every action was subject to scrutiny, interpretation, and the possibility of exposure, creating a delicate equilibrium in which power was recalibrated, not through overt confrontation, but through the unassailable presence of evidence, reason, and a refusal to compromise the truth of my own experience. During this period, I also devoted time to reflecting on the emotional and psychological toll that years of subtle manipulation had exacted, recognizing patterns of self-doubt, internalized guilt, and the quiet, persistent questioning of my own worth that had been instilled under the guise of parental guidance. And as I confronted these internalized narratives, I found a sense of resolve emerging, a determination to disentangle the threads of imposed limitation from the fabric of my authentic self, understanding that reclaiming authority over my life required not only confrontation with others, but a rigorous examination of the ways I had internalized their control, transforming that reflection into a framework for personal growth, resilience, and deliberate self-determination. By the end of the week, the dynamic within the household had shifted perceptibly, a subtle yet undeniable realignment that was evident in tone, interaction, and the careful consideration with which my parents now approached conversations and decisions. And while the broader patterns of favoritism or neglect could not be entirely erased, the act of asserting truth through documentation, measured presentation, and unwavering confidence had created a new standard for engagement, one in which manipulation could no longer operate unchecked, and in which my presence, agency, and perspective demanded recognition as valid, consequential, and independent of the expectations or biases that had previously dictated the terms of interaction. As I reflected on the culmination of this experience, I understood that the most profound transformation was not found in anger, revenge, or validation, but in the quiet, unyielding assertion of ownership over my own life, the deliberate, evidence-based reclamation of narrative that empowered me to move forward with clarity, self-respect, and the unshakable understanding that while the past could not be rewritten, the future was now a canvas upon which I alone could define the terms, boundaries, and dimensions of my existence. And in embracing that autonomy, I found a profound, enduring satisfaction, the realization that truth, when wielded with precision, patience, and courage, becomes not merely a statement of fact, but a catalyst for transformation, liberation, and the definitive establishment of self in a world where recognition must often be claimed rather than granted.